Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar Ortiz, and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to episode 328 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar Ortiz and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant. And in today's episode, I had the pleasure of finally recording with Wayne Turmel, who is another trainer, coach who's been in the remote world space for ages and who I've come across in conferences. And he's a great master of ceremonies. He's a lot of fun. And it was a pleasure to have him for an hour during this conversation. And we talked about culture, especially in hybrid spaces, and especially about culture in organizations now, the challenges of designing or trying to influence the culture in an organization where people have worked remotely for a forced amount of time, and now there's options to go back, not to go back, there's mandates, etc. So in one way, this episode is very timely. It's May 2023. On the other hand, we speak about stuff that is evergreen, like what is culture and how do we define and help define how people work in an organization, what is specific to our organization. Wayne is a master trainer and coach at the Kevin Eikenbery group, and he's also the co-author of The Long Distance Leader, The Long Distance Teammate, and more recently, The Long Distance Team. And they're all books covering how to make the most out of the remote or hybrid space. Now, Wayne is also the co-host of Long Distance Work Life, and this is a show I recommend. It is really fun. It's all about remote work, and Wayne talks to guests, but every other week he also talks with his co-host, Marisa Eikenbery, about different aspects of remote work. And Marisa is younger, and I mention this because the fact that they're both from different generations gives the show a broad perspective, and it makes it a lot of fun too. So thoroughly recommend Long Distance Work Life. Right, that's it. So let's get into the conversation with Wayne. And to start with, I asked him what kind of work he's involved with now at the Kevin Eikenbery Group.
Well, of course, Kevin, for at least as long as I have, has been a well-respected leadership thinker. His book, Remarkable Leadership, is really, really a terrific introduction to leadership in general in the workplace. And what we've done is we've taken what was my expertise in the virtual and online space and merged it into that so that leaders are allowed to think about just leadership and how you do it when people are separate, or if you have a hybrid team, is a matter of degree and small changes. It's not some radical shift. And so we're normalizing remote and hybrid work, if you will. And if you don't yet lead a remote or a hybrid team, odds are, if you've got any kind of career at all, you will soon enough.
So I really see the long distance brand as emerging.
Well, to be strictly commercial, if we're going to be completely mercenary about it, calling it remote work, but the 3 books in the series, Long Distance Leader, Long Distance Teammate, and now the new book, which is why I'm here finally, is The Long Distance Team, Designing Your Team for Everyone's Success. And since the books are branded Long Distance Work Life, and our podcast is called Long Distance Work Life, it kind of makes sense that we move long distance into the name and kind of phase out remote.
Yeah. I think that it is really interesting. And I actually hadn't thought of that until you've just said it now. Listeners, so for those of you who've been with us for a long while, you might remember Kevin Eikenbery coming on the show 181 in October 2018. And that was to talk about the long distance leader. And now, of course, you have co-authored again with him, this time the long distance team. So the three books, let's say the first one was on leadership, the long distance leader. Then the next one was long distance teammate. Is that right?
Was the long distance teammate. So with long distance leader, and remember, this is 2018. This is before the world lost its mind. We were getting, why does this feel so awkward? Why does this feel so strange? Can you lead effectively in a virtual and long distance environment? And so that was that book. And then we said, well, what about the individual teammates? If we think about what the changes are that remote work is kind of bringing about, how you're seen as a teammate, how you show up to your manager, how you stay engaged and keep your career on track, all has changed. And so long distance leader was obviously for those with titles, right, that have the leadership job. Long distance teammate is how do we stay engaged and passionate and effective and be seen as a good teammate when we don't share office space. But those were individual kind of books. And, you know, Peter Drucker, and you know that I'm old because I'm quoting Peter Drucker, but Peter Drucker once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so, in other words, you can have all the plans you want. As an individual leader, this is how we're going to work. But we do that work inside of something else. We do that work inside a team, inside an organization. And so if the organization or the team isn't set up to support those good behaviors and that kind of mindset, people are going to struggle. And so this last book, and it is, I suspect, the last book in the series, the long distance team is really helping to create the environment where long distance leaders and long distance teammates can thrive.
And I suppose the thing that's coming to mind as well, just the timing of it. I mean, one thing that's been on my mind is that there has been so much focus on individual flexibility and the autonomy that remote work can bring, and asynchronous communication can bring that autonomy, that actually I feel like we need to start pulling back and go, yeah, but we are still working within a larger entity. So it's interesting that as well.
Well, timing is, you mentioned timing, and I will confess, I often kind of denigrate what we do by saying it's better to be lucky than good, because our long distance leader came out in 2018. Long distance teammate literally came out 2 months before COVID.
Yeah.
And then long distance team is coming out just as a lot of organizations are giving serious thought to return to the office. And we're hearing a lot from companies all over the world that say, we had this great culture, we had the culture that we really liked, and then people got sent home, and now they're coming back, but not everybody's going to be in the office all the time. We're going to be in this weird hybrid thing. And can we save our culture, or can we be the same company that we were in the before times? And so the timing for this conversation is really good, because we're at this inflection point where we actually have a moment to stop and think. You know, as we're coming out of COVID and thinking about what the workplace is going to look like, this is the time to start thinking about that stuff and being conscious and intentional about it before we're just running so fast we don't have time anymore.
So this book then is, we're looking at, you've mentioned culture. Now, I'm going to ask you, I'm sure you've done this in already in lots of conversations talking about the book, but can you tell us what you mean by culture?
Well, there's a glib answer, and then there's actually a really specific answer. The glib answer is that culture is a catch-all term that basically means this is how we do it here. Mm-hmm. Right? And It doesn't, if you walk into any family, within about 5 minutes, you understand the culture in that family. If you walk into we've all done this. We've walked into an office and thought, oh, this is kind of a cool place to work. Everybody looked, or, oh, dear Lord, get me out of here because this is, yeah. And that's the culture. And it's easy to say very glibly, well, this is how we do it here. So company XYZ might be really, really focused on creating the best possible code, right? And they're very perfection driven. Versus another company, which is all about, we want this to be a great place to work and we want people to be collegial. Well, those two companies are both fine and they're both very good and they're different, right? What we tried to do is get beyond that glib kind of catch-all answer. If culture is how we do it here, what's the it that you do? How does work get done? How do people interact with each other? How people get promoted in this organization? What are the things that make it a good place to work? Why would people want to work there? Those are the things, if you add up all those 1,000 little things, that's what makes up the culture. And to complicate it, there are two levels of culture. There's the macro culture, which is here at Company X, we believe this. And then there's the team culture, right? The nuclear team. And how does that team operate? And they may be complementary, but very different. You know, a company may say, we want to be a great place to work. But if you look at the sales team and how they interact with each other and how they work, and you look at the engineers, they may operate very differently. They work inside the macro culture, but engineering is a function of, you've got a bunch of engineers and they're working on engineering problems. And the amount of time they spend collaborating is different than sales, where it's individuals with goals who largely work by themselves. And by the way, highly competitive. So culture is, if you look at whatever it is you're trying to measure, whether it's the organization or the team, what are the 1,000 little things? And we've created this kind of simple model for getting our heads around that, because it can be like this huge thing. But as always, if you really want to study it and you want to change the behavior and you want to be intentional, you need to cut that elephant into very small chunks in order to eat it.
Nice. One question before we go into that, because I think that's very interesting to go into the model briefly. But before that, so you're mentioning about the organizational culture and then the team culture that might emerge. Do you think that's more likely to happen under the new hybrid space, or actually it's always been there to a degree? Maybe we didn't think about it as much.
I think we have to be careful. I think the thing is, we just didn't think about it. When you walk into the building and the name is on the door and everybody's there, you don't need to think about the culture because it permeates everything. Everything you do is surrounded. You know, there's a great quote. I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. That the fish is so busy swimming and it doesn't know that there's land and air and, you know, places where you don't swim. And I think what's happening is you always have a culture. Always have a culture. Right? Whether you recognize and can define it, whether you like it. And what's happening is we're going from whatever we had before, and we went through a change. And many organizations feel like they did a pretty good job of preserving whatever that previous culture was when everybody was remote. But as we start to move to hybrid work, and this is a very long, deep rabbit hole that we can go down, it's very difficult to maintain the exact same culture in a hybrid environment that you had when everybody was all together. Now, does it mean it's impossible to create one? No. Can you preserve the best things of your culture? And we submit that you can, you just need to be intentional about it. It's not going to happen organically because a lot of organizations have let their culture just kind of form. And at some point it exists. And when new people get hired, they better figure out what this new what this culture is in order to thrive and survive in it. Because we're at this turning point, we can maybe be a little more intentional about asking some hard questions, right? I mean, there are three things. There's what's the culture that we had? What did we like about it? What did we think made it a great place to work? And I suspect that most of us, unless you worked in the Garden of Eden, there were probably things about that previous culture that you could live with but didn't like, maybe things you just kind of ignored. But there was the culture that you had. There's the culture that you have today, which most people haven't done intentionally because we've been thrown into the deep end of remote work and everybody just kind of adjusted. But there's what is the culture that you want going forward? And that's why this inflection point in time is so important because you can actually stop and say, what did I like about the before times? What do I like and works about now? And what kind of culture do we want where we can keep and improve the things that are working and maybe do some things differently that allow us to be this new aspirational.
Before we go on to how might that intentionality look like, I just wanted to touch on you mentioned going into the office and we maybe didn't think about culture because, well, there's this thing around us and sometimes what we're seeing is maybe so strong that we forget that actually there's lots of other layers and things happen. Do you think that maybe it's about the fact that we're used to seeing these artifacts and these representations of the culture of aspirational culture in the offices, and because we don't have those in the online space, we're almost having to shift how we see culture and how we think about it? I don't know. I wonder where that fits in, where the building and those
Well, I think
visuals.
it starts because human beings are hardwired for visual connection. We're hardwired to see things. We don't see what's there, but we notice when something is off or we notice when something is wrong because that's what saves us from getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are hardwired to do that. We are hardwired to communicate socially. When we see other humans, we do some very unique things. Even on a webcam call, the minute somebody's face pops up, most of us smile.
Mm.
That is a hardwired biological response to let, some stranger on the savannah know that you are not a threat to them. I mean,
Yes.
so if we think about office culture as beginning kind of in the Victorian age, we're talking about 150 or so years where we've taken everything we know about how to interact with humans and we've crammed it into this office culture where we've learned the rules and we abide by them because we're in them every single day. And then all of a sudden, we were pulled out of that. So we didn't have the visual cues and we didn't have, people wearing the company uniform or seeing the posters on the wall or any of those things. And shockingly, to a lot of senior leaders, people still think of themselves as working at company XYZ. One of the things that happened during the early days of the pandemic that nobody anticipated was that employee engagement scores went up significantly. Well, they're not in the office. They're not seeing each other. They're working from home. How can that be? Well, because work isn't where you go every day. work is, what do you do and who do you work with and who are your customers and what are the tasks that make up that job. And so physical space was part of culture, and it was the obvious part of culture, but there was so much more to it.
That will make me think of stuff later. I'll take that with me.
We don't want that to happen.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. So let's go then into we are now aware that this is an opportunity to design or to influence our culture more than maybe we've thought about before. So where would we start? I don't know if you want to start at the level of the organization or the team. How do we start to look at this?
Let's look at the team, because that's easier.
Yeah,
right?
It is.
There is, there's the leader, and then there's the people who report to the leader. And that's kind of what we call the nuclear team. Like the nuclear family is mom, dad, kids living in the house. The nuclear team is Pilar's the boss, and we all work for her, and we have a similar function. And so we are the nuclear team. And what many people experienced is that if the nuclear team existed before COVID and had good working relationships and a positive culture, they've been able to maintain that really well. As a matter of fact, they've gotten tighter because we've had to pull together and we have each other's backs. And, we've been through this crisis together, which is great. That's a beautiful thing. But there are 3 years of people who were hired during this time who are now joining that team. And how do we onboard them? How do we bring them in? How do we make them understand how we do it here in a way that welcomes, includes them, and helps them become a functional, contributing member of the team as quickly as possible? And we've had to rethink how we do that. How do we onboard people? How do we train them? How do we bring them in? And there's another complicating factor that a lot of those of us that have been around for a while didn't consider. When we went home, our touchstone was, well, this is like being in the office, except. It's like being in the office, except we're going to be on webcam once in a while. It's like being in the office, except instead of leaning over to somebody's desk, you send them a chat message. But we have 3 years of new hires coming out of university or wherever who don't know what it means to work in the office. They never worked in the office. Right? It used to be they came out of school, maybe they worked as interns and got some idea, but they came out of school and they were dumped into this office environment, and they learned, how do we interact, and how do you react, and how loud do you speak on the phone, and lots of things that we take for granted. And what's funny is one of the big complaints I'm hearing about returning to the office, I had one manager look at me with all the seriousness she could muster and say, I almost wish they didn't come back because my people have gone feral. They're like cats that have been turned out of the house and allowed to run wild, and there's no reining them in. They don't dress professionally because they're used to wearing sweatpants and t-shirts while they work all day. And they don't know how to be quiet when somebody else is on the phone next to them. And these kinds of office behaviors that were just the water we swam in for years, we need to be intentional about them. We need to create rules that we never thought we'd have to make before, because people just knew how to do that. Well, now, not so much.
I hadn't thought of that at all. That is something, I've heard of course, of lots of people changing jobs, joining companies, being onboarded. But I think maybe I haven't come across the more junior members of society doing this. I've always been in the manager thing. But I love that, because also what might be happening as well is when we're coming now back to the office and there's all these norms and part of the culture which just because that's how it's always been. So like the dress codes and stuff like that. And we'd never had to question them before, or we've never even seen that actually that was a choice that we were making in our cultures. Not that that's the only way of coming in here, is that that's part of who we are.
And how much does it matter?
Yeah.
How much does it matter what we wear? In some organizations, it matters. We dress up, we look professional because we are customer facing, and this is the image we want our customers to see. In other companies, a customer never comes to our office. We never meet our end user. So what does it matter? Right? And so there's all these assumptions and all these things that all of a sudden we can't assume, and we can't know that everybody thinks about this the same way we do, which is the point. If you're going to be intentional about the culture, you need to ask these questions. And if you want people to buy in rather than just comply, they need to be included in the conversation.
I love that a lot of what I've been hearing is how do we create culture online? But of course, we're now at a point where actually it's both spaces. If you have a hybrid organization, it's both spaces, and you're going to have to look at how your culture how you operate in the office as well, and that make that culture as intentional as the online space, the use of the online space, and the fact that some of your people are remote.
Well, and this is why Turn to Office has been such a car wreck for so many companies. Because they either said, we're going to go back and use the exact same rules and norms that we used in the before time, because we can't wait to get back to the way it was. Or the senior leaders kind of sat down and said, we're going to be intentional about creating this. So we're going to create a policy, and everybody's just going to get with the program and it'll be fine. And what we've learned is a few things. Number one is a lot of the assumptions we made were incorrect about how often people were willing to come back, what did they want from a workplace. A lot of those assumptions just turned out not to be true. Also, a lot of people came back to the office and after about 3 weeks went, oh, I remember why I hated this. Like there was a honeymoon period where everybody was glad to be back together, and this looked and smelled like normal. And so some of the pressure was off. But then we started to remember that, an hour each way to work really bites into your life. And, the way that the desks were configured didn't, meant Bob was always bothering me and I couldn't get any work done and those types of things. And so one of the things, and I wish Kevin had thought of this brilliant phrase before the book came out, and he didn't, is as we're talking to people about this, we're always telling them pilot before policy. This notion that get together with your team, come up with a set of rails to run on because you have to, but take the time to assess it and see how it's going and say, do we need to tweak this? Do we need to change this? Before you create the handbook that says this is how we do it here.
That's really nice. I really like the pilot before policy. And
it's a great phrase. I wish he had thought of it while we could still get it in the book.
Yeah. Well, there's always a second edition.
I suppose that's true.
So how do you suggest, or what are you seeing then? What might be some of the first steps in understanding? Because I think, I'm just going to go back because it's making me think. I suppose in a way we need to understand if the culture we had or what aspects of it we want to retain. And there are then the opportunities that the new setup can help us to maybe encourage new sets of working and behaviors. How do we start?
Okay, so let's take a breath, because again,
that's the first thing.
This becomes this very big elephant, right? There's so much to consider. How do you even begin doing that? And that's why, okay, culture is how we do it here. What's it? What's the work that gets done? What's the things that we want people to know and do, how do we compensate people, all that good stuff. And in order to get our hands around that, we broke it down into what we call the 3C model. If you think about what supports your culture: communication, collaboration, and cohesion. So communication is, how do we talk to each other? Right? And that's not just, do we use Microsoft Teams? Do we use webcams? Do we watch our tone, right? Are we a highly competitive kind of environment where it's okay to push and shove, figuratively, push and shove and compete and, strive to get the best possible answer? Or are we all about collegiality? Do we meet in person? Does everything have to be a meeting? Or are we looking at asynchronous solutions that look? So how are we going to communicate? The second pillar is, how does the work get done? Right? So first of all, what's the work that needs to be done? But how does work get done, and how do we work together to make that happen? So, one of the big surprises during COVID is, I remember in about 2019 or so, I saw this list. These are the jobs that are best suited to work remotely. And these are the jobs that absolutely need to be done in the office. And by 2021, we learned that both those lists were nonsense, right? That there were jobs that we never thought could be done remotely. That can be done perfectly fine remotely. And there are jobs that, we need some face-to-face time, and we need to collaborate in certain ways that maybe we shouldn't be 100% remote. So studying what is the work that needs to be done, what is the job flow, what are the tasks, when do people do better work when they work synchronously, and if they work synchronously, do they work synchronously in person together? So communication, how do we communicate in this organization? And that is both the how in terms of technology and the how in terms of thinking about communication strategy. And, do we tell the people in the office first and then blow it out to the rest of the employees? Do we do town hall meetings, right? That's all communication. Collaboration is, how does the work get done? And then cohesion is, how do we come together to form the relationships and the bonds and the connections that allow not only work to get done the way it needs to get done, but make this the kind of place that we want to be in and that will attract people and make people want to stay. I mean, one of the things, as you well know, that we've learned about remote work is the people who are engaged and working remotely or working hybrid are the most engaged people you have. Self-motivated, they care, they're doing good work, their work-life balance might be a little more in order, so they're a little less miserable. There's all these things, right, that mean if people are working remotely and engaged, they're doing great. The problem is the people who work remotely and are actively disengaged are really, really disengaged. So are you creating a place where people will willingly engage and do what they need to do beyond just mere compliance? Because if they're working remotely and they're actively disengaged, you're going to lose those people. And sometimes that's no great loss. If they're actively disengaged and they're not active in the culture and they're not enjoying themselves and you're not enjoying them, maybe they'll be happier somewhere else. And the barriers to leaving jobs. If I work 100% remote and I get mad at my manager and I go on Indeed and I find another job, and by the way, nobody can see me do that, right? I go online and I find another job. The only barrier to me changing jobs is I need a new login and password. I sit in the same chair. I'm in the same place. I don't have to change my commute. I don't have to change my my childcare. I don't have to change anything except who the money comes from. So are we creating places that people will willingly engage and want to stay and want to be and, will put in the work?
Yeah, that's a really useful framework, I think, that can really start. I think that for one, like you're saying, can start a conversation. I think that conversation is one that, well, we haven't had in many years. I mean, definitely not during COVID. We didn't have time. We probably weren't having it before either. What is collaboration? How do we communicate and all of that? So I think it's a fantastic way to even just start the conversation.
And that's what it's about, right? It's before we were just doing it. And if you joined a company, the culture was what it was, get on board or don't. And this is how we do it here. And we often hired for fit, which of course is a double-edged sword at the best of times. Because yes, the good news is there's less tension and people get up to speed, but we also tend to exclude really good people when we are hiring for cultural fit. We were so busy doing it, and then we got thrown across the Rubicon, and then we were scrambling just to survive. How do we get the work done? How do we stay productive? How do we stay connected as a team? We literally didn't have time to think about. We just were flailing and hoping we didn't sink. And then eventually we figured out, I'm not going to sink. Okay, so that kind of normalized into whatever we've done for the last couple of years. But as I said at the beginning, we are at this inflection point where we've had 3 years of work that we never expected to have and do. And it's changed not only the way we work, but the way we live.
Yeah.
The number of people who report that by working remotely, they essentially got a 5 to 10% raise in salary because they weren't paying for commuting, they weren't paying for parking, they weren't eating in the city, they they didn't have to pay the same kind of childcare. There was all of these societal and structural changes in people's lives. And so we're at this point where we have capabilities to work that we've never thought of before. People are thinking differently about what do I want my work to look like. And companies are figuring out things like, which office space do we need? And can we really get the work done if people don't come together? And so we're in this storm where, since everybody's asking questions anyway, let's have the conversations. Let's ask these questions together. Because there is an answer, and it's not a perfect answer, and it will be different for every organization. A friend of mine in a large utility company started doing interviews with people about coming back to office. And what she found, which was greatly distressing to the company and made perfect sense to me, is there was about 10% of the people who had been working remotely couldn't wait to get back to the office. And there was another 10% who said, if you make me come back into the office, I will quit because I ain't doing that again. And there were 80% of the people, as with all good bell curves, right? There were 80% of the people who said, I'd like to go in sometimes, but I don't want to go in 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. And the organization was shocked because they assumed that aside from the malcontents, everybody couldn't get back to the way it was in the before times. And some organizations are saying, that's nice. I bet you would like not to come in. but we have a business to run and this is our business and get with the program. And there are companies that are making that decision. Is it the right decision? I don't know. I don't run that company. We'll see.
We shall see.
Logic tells me that if people are asking for more flexibility and you're not giving it to them, at some point they will vote with their feet. The ones that were most likely to do that already have. That was the Great Resignation, which wasn't really the Great Resignation. It was organizations just choosing not to accommodate people. And they said, okay, I'll go somewhere where they will. Every organization is going to do what's right for it. But the rise of hybrid work seems to be the natural conclusion of all of this chaos. The thing is, what is hybrid work? And most people, I think, don't really understand what hybrid work will become. I'm going to give you an example. Right now, most people think of hybrid work as, well, it's, we have the same hours, but some people are there physically and some people aren't. And we're going to have a meeting room with cameras and microphones and we're going to make adjustments. And But that's a blend. That's not a true hybrid. In biological terms, a hybrid is something that takes characteristic of one parent and the characteristic of the other parent and creates this totally new thing. I literally eat an apple a day. I love apples. And you go into the grocery store and there are like 20 different kinds of apples. And they have each been bred for very specific properties. And there's an apple called a Gala apple here in North America, which is a small, crunchy, looks great apple. And it's inexpensive to grow. But it was grown because it looks good on the grocery shelf. It actually starts to age and rot from the inside out, which means it can sit on the shelf for a very long time looking red and shiny and yummy. And that's what it's designed to do. It's a hybrid. It has all of these characteristics, and it is very different. And a Gala apple tastes different and has a different texture and lasts longer on the shelves and can be grown cheaper than other types of apples because it's a hybrid. Hybrid work is not only going to be where are people when they're working and how does the work get done and where do they sit when that work gets done, but it introduces a whole new complicating factor, which is time. It's not only where does the work get done and how do we meet or not meet, but it introduces time. Does it matter that everybody starts at the same time? Right? Does it matter that people are online at the same time so they can answer each other's questions? Right? It might mean we need at least a couple of hours in a day so you can take flexibility within these kinds of parameters. Or I don't care when you get your work done, as long as you get your work done. Time is the new complicating factor in determining whether hybrid work is going to work. Because if you say, yeah, you can work from home 3 days a week, but you better be online at 9 o'clock Eastern time and you better be there until 4. I live in a 3-hour time zone difference from my boss. Does that matter? Some days. But I don't know what this is going to look like 6 months or a year from now. That's the part that's going to be really interesting. And so you can either do trial and error and bump into things and see if this works and go, oh, that was an expensive lesson. Or you can be intentional about it. And the questions you ask should include things like, when does the work get done? And when does it need to be done synchronously? And when can it be done asynchronously? And which is the best? And how do we teach people that?
Yeah, there's a whole opportunity to redesign as well how we're working and some of the stuff that we've always done in a certain way because of
That's the
that.
subtitle of the book, Designing Your Team for Everyone's Success, instead of just letting it happen.
I think that is really important because the word culture has been used a lot, but culture, the way that I've heard it used is being about the social aspect of work. And I think that the piece that has been missing is that redesign of the work as well. It should all be, it's all interlinked. That's why it's work and not a social club as well.
But we can't ignore the social part of
Oh, no.
I mean, people who focus solely on outcomes and business frequently underestimate. We have to remember that pre-COVID, the average white collar worker, the average worker, got 60% of their social interaction for the week at work. Think about it. Where do we spend the most time with the most people? And sometimes those are just the people we work with. Sometimes it's customers, whatever. But
the traveling,
all of that stuff, it used to be the workplace was almost 2/3 of our social interaction for the week. And then we took people and, when you're working remotely, you could work entire days and not actually talk to another person. I was hired for my first big boy job at the beginning of email. The first major project I worked on was rolling email out to my organization. In those 30-ish years, average office worker, white collar worker, whatever, knowledge worker, whatever word you want to use, now does 70% of their workplace communication in writing. That has never happened in the history of humanity. We have always been visual and verbal communicators. And writing supported that. Writing allowed us to kind of keep records and things. But now you can go entire days and never actually have a conversation with another human. Even with our kids, I have a 30-year-old who I have to keep reminding her that phones do transmit voice because all she wants to do is text. That changes how humans interact. It changes how we build relationships. It changes a lot of things.
And the other question I have for you is, well, how does the different geographical cultures then fit into this? There was an example in the book where you talked about the satellites and how they're experiencing the change differently as well.
Well, that was a really interesting case study because we watched it happen in front of our eyes. We had a large multinational corporation. They were centered in Asia, but they had, plants and facilities and offices throughout the US. And when they started talking about returning to office, the people who were either from the original culture or were trained and raised in that original culture had a very different response to turn to office and hybrid work than the North American managers. And some of that chalk up to it was originally a very command and control type of organization. There was a very Korean approach to networking and career building, and this is how careers were built. And if that's your paradigm, it's going to be harder to adjust and change. Whereas, the American managers were a little more comfortable with allowing people to work from home. And it had to do with how do we supervise people. But it's easy to say, oh, this group of people believes in total command and control. That's not entirely true. It's some of it. I mean, how do you manage performance? How do you know people are working? But it's also, how do you succeed? There's been a lot of talk, especially in financial institutions. American financial institutions Wall Street is saying, yeah, I understand work-life balance, but if you really want a career and you want to succeed, you will get your butt back here. And they've been very clear that work from home is fine if all you want is a paycheck. But if you want a career and a career track and you really want to be successful, you will get back to the office because that's how it's worked for 200 years and that's how it will continue to work. And it's easy to cast these people as ogres or dinosaurs who don't understand that the world has changed. But let's grant them a little grace here. They came up and learned by networking, by putting in long hours, by being physically proximate to their mentors and coaches and other people, by socializing together, by doing. And so the people who are now senior leaders in that organization know no other way to get the work done. And they've been successful, and they want their people to be successful. They want people to have careers. They want people to grow in the business. They want that. And so they only know one way to do it. And maybe for that industry or for that organization, that's how it's going to get done. I suspect somebody will come along and break the paradigm. We're already seeing that. There's Alan Whiting, who is the CEO of a top 10 financial CPA firm, who has expressly said, we are blowing up the business model. We are going remote first. We are going to continue to have offices, but they're primarily for meetings and connection. And if you can get your work done wherever you can get your work done, God love you, have at it. How much of a success they are able to do? Are they able to be profitable? Are they able to grow? Are they able to become an employer of choice? Is probably going to have ripple effects through the rest of that industry. But he's making a conscious choice.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It's that now we know that regardless of where the choice is or what we decide, we now know that there is a conscious choice involved. It's not just the way things are, because there's many ways in which things are.
Well, and that,
Nice.
in many ways puts a lovely loop around what we've been talking about for the
Yes.
last however long we've been talking about it, because there's the culture that you have. There's the culture that you have now, right? There's what was, there's what you have now, and there's the culture that you want to have and you can aspire to, and you can actually intentionally work towards that if you are intentional about it.
Good. So I think I'm going to start wrapping up. I mean, we could talk about this for ages, of course. That's what we love. So apart from Long Distance Team and, of course, the two previous books as well, you are co-hosting the Long Distance Work-Life podcast with the lovely Marissa Eikenbery.
With the lovely Marissa Eikenbery, who sends on her regards. And Pilar has been a guest on our podcast. So do take the chance to check that out.
Tell us what is the show about and anything you've discovered through your guests that has surprised you, maybe.
The Long Distance Work Life is a 20-minute-ish weekly podcast, and we alternate between sessions where it's Marissa and I. I am literally twice Marissa's age. And so she is a digital native. She's a, millennial. She has questions and she takes questions from our listeners, and we have discussions, just the two of us. And then we alternate that with interviews with people who are changing technology and people like you who are thought leaders in remote and hybrid work. But really the goal is to help people get their thoughts around the new way that we're working. I mean, sometimes we talk about leading remote teams. Sometimes we talk about being the individual contributor and just coping with the craziness. And you've been listening to me this long. You have figured out that it's a pretty high energy, candid. We don't hold a lot of punches when we talk about things. But it's a good time, and you can find us where you find podcasts, or you can go to longdistanceworklife.com.
Excellent. Thanks, Wayne. So I think we're going to wrap up, but I do need to ask you very quickly. Sorry, I keep saying when I wrap up. Your fiction writing, is that something that you talk about?
Well, it's something I'll gladly talk about. I just don't know. I have written, well over a dozen short stories that have been published, and my 5th novel came out in December. And I don't write under a pseudonym. So if you look up my name, in Amazon or whatever, you'll find everything that I do. It's my release. It's my artistic release. I love writing fiction. It's a lot of fun. The problem is that on shows like this, I often don't talk about it. I go on, writer podcasts and talk about my fiction, and I go on business podcasts and talk about this, because the Venn diagram of people who care about leading remote teams and enjoy the adventures of werewolf detectives is a very thin slice.
Yeah. Oh, but how great.
And so, I'm happy to talk about my fiction all day long. So if you care, you can go to WayneTurmel.com, and you will learn nothing about anything that Pilar and I have talked about yet today, and everything about my novels. Whether you like historical fiction or urban fantasy, I hope you find something there that you like, and thank you for giving me the chance to do that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Wayne, so that's where we will direct our listeners to WayneTurmel.com. Are you active in any social media that you would point people to?
I am everywhere. The only one where my worlds overlap is Twitter. If you go to @WTurmel on Twitter, you will find both my business life and my personal ramblings and my fiction writing. Otherwise, if you go to kevineikenbery.com, LinkedIn is entirely my business side of my life. You can go to Wayne Turmel Author and on Facebook and see the other side of my life, assuming you care. I would love everybody to join me in both. But my world is slightly bipolar at the moment.
No. Yours and lots of us. I think it's a sign of the times as well, I think. Wayne Turmel, what a pleasure. Thank you very much for visiting us at the 21st Century Work Life podcast.
Well, I'm glad we could finally make this happen, Pilar. We have been colleagues for a fairly long time now, and it's nice that we can reciprocate in each other's worlds.
A big thank you to Ross Winter for polishing the audio of this episode. And thank you, listeners, for choosing to listen to the 21st Century Work Life podcast. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.